I'm Adam from Industry Tattoo Supply. I'm going to be presenting on tattoo supply today, some of the history, some of the regulations, what's going on in the world. Like tattoo, it's been going through a lot of change. So things are getting bigger, it's attracting regulators, it's attracting the attention of the media, it's attracting commercial investors, and this is having an impact, and I think it's something to talk about. What I want people to come away with from today is just a little bit more thought on who they're choosing as their supplier, because there's a massive amount of choices. A lot of us are selling the same stuff, but a lot of us are offering a little bit more than, say, buying from mass markets. Like, you can get people who are buying off Temu and Amazon, and there are consequences of that. So if you take away anything from today, it's just trying to think more about who you're buying from and why. Just like choosing a tattooist, it does have consequences and it's important. So everything that we're talking about today, we have published as a series of blogs, so that sets out the structure of this chat. I won't be covering everything, so there's a lot more detail in there if you want to record it, and or if you have questions. And I'll also be including some content that's not in those blogs today, because we couldn't publish it. So in that, I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning. We are talking about tattoo history. We're going to go back 1.5 centuries. And so there are images that under today's lens are considered maybe disturbing or offensive. If you're offended or disturbed by those sorts of things, probably would say this one's not for you. But please note, they're not presented to offend in any way. They are presented as part of the historical context of what was going on at that time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about history. So getting into tattooing, and tattooing as a profession really kicked off around the mid-1800s. So tattooing has been around for centuries, of course, but probably more as a cultural thing, and markings for their tribes or that sort of symbolism. But as a job that you could get paid for, started to emerge around that time. Now, people would often get their first tattoo machine or get these stuff from some bloke who was throwing it in at the pub, or one of their mates. They might cobble together some equipment. But once they got their gear, that was only the start of the problems, because there were no suppliers, there was no internet. They had to get around and scrounge for their equipment that they needed. So these guys were real craftsmen. They had machine knowledge, they were able to solder things. So they had to scrounge around for these parts that they needed. We've got here the grandfather clock. So you had your winding mechanism tucked away the back, and that was a good source of spring steel. You could go through bicycle wheels, take the spokes off them, and they would be your needle bars. The word bug pin comes from what entomologists used to put the bugs in. That made a nice little needle that you could solder on, or even people were using cotton twine and those sorts of things to attach it to the needle bar. So you used to go around through a lot of things. It was Wagner, Johann Wagner, not the famous tattooist Wagner, invented the electric doorbell. So that came out in 1839, and that was where we saw the use of coils to move something up and down through an electromagnet. And that really then formed the basis of what people would attribute. They saw, okay, well, this is ringing a bell up and down. I can attach a needle to that, and that creates what was a tattoo machine. Going through the patents that were coming out, so I talked about the electric doorbell, but it was actually the electric pen that Edison patented in 1876 that formed a handheld version, and people then combined those two designs to what became almost unchanged, the tattoo coil machine that we see today. A patent doesn't mean anything. People attribute the first tattoo machine design to Samuel O'Reilly because he patented it as the first one in 1891. The patent made no sense at all. It was to create a patent, you didn't have to have a working model, you just had to have a picture, and that's what you see there. And it makes no sense because there's two 90-degree bends in the tube, so no needle's going to move properly with a mechanism like that. At the same time in the UK, Tom Riley was also credited with one of the designs, and he actually took Edison's coil and he took the coil of the doorbell and put it into Thomas Edison's design and created a single coil. But we don't have that pattern, and it's actually suggested that, although it's documented that he was one of the first guys to put that pattern in place, that's actually myth. It wasn't, he didn't actually create a pattern. No one, to my knowledge, has even been able to see it. So if you have seen it, please find it, because it's not on the internet, and so once it's not on Google, it doesn't exist. But there is some credence to it, because one of his brothers or brother-in-laws actually worked for Thomas Edison, so he was a mucker, and a mucker is someone that tries out designs and tests them, and so it's not unreasonable to suggest that this guy then talked to Tom Riley, and then the two of them put these designs together. Tom Riley certainly did make some beautiful tattoo machines around this time, and George Burchett said that he bought his first tattoo machine from Tom Riley. So these guys, while their patents may not mean anything, they obviously made some great machines, and that's where machines started to come from. So the guys that did have some sort of machine skills and were able to put equipment together, they became pretty popular, and they started to realise they could make some money from this, and you started to have the first suppliers start to emerge. These guys started to sell globally. They could advertise in journals like Billboard magazine and Popular Mechanics, and you had artists like Percy Waters, Bert Grimm, Milton Zeiss, Joseph Hartley, who sold some of the first commercial flash. They started to sell their stuff from the 1920s. Most of these guys focused on the main items that they themselves produced, be it a machine, be it pigments, be it flash. So it's probably Spaulding and Rogers that came along as the first comprehensive supplier. So if I talk through some of the main suppliers that emerged, the Zeiss Studio. So this was founded by Milton Zeiss in the 1940s. He was a commercial artist, and so it's no surprise that the Zeiss Studio was one of the major sources of commercial flash at the time, and is quite famous for some of the most used common designs that we see today. Like he published the Crawling Panther, for instance. That Panther sheet is iconic. Zeiss Studio still exists, although Milton Zeiss has long passed away. You can go on there, you can buy some flash. He created a bunch of stuff, including a Zeiss School of Tattooing. So he had a school which was done via correspondence. You could sign up to his school, pay some money, of course, because that's what it was all about. And you would get a little course book, and you could submit photos and drawings back to him, and he'd give you some feedback. One of the guys that contributed to that school was Phil Sparrow, and Phil Sparrow was Ed Hardy's first teacher. So he actually gave Ed Hardy one of his first tattoos, not his first one, but one of his first few. So these are respected tattooists, and Phil said, he wrote an article, I believe, around large-scale tattoos, and that went into this Zeiss tattoo manual, and Phil said it was about as useful as learning to swim from your lounge room. Completely hopeless, of course, but that didn't stop them selling it. Along came Huck Spaulding. Huck actually started his business by buying Owen Jensen's business. So Owen Jensen had a small supply business, and Huck actually bought his first tattoo machine from Owen Jensen. Huck was a businessman. He was all about making money, and he was surrounded by some fantastic tattooists. So Huck started out pretty horrible himself. He wasn't really considered a good tattooist. He was pretty rough, but he did share a studio with Paul Rogers, hence Spaulding and Rogers was the name of the studio, and when he bought Jensen's business it became Spaulding and Rogers Tattoo Supply. Paul Rogers wasn't really involved in the business. I think Huck was just using his name more or less, but Paul had no problem giving Huck plenty of advice. You also had people like Bill Jones, or Jonesy, who used to make machines with Charlie Wagner. He worked with Huck Spaulding and their machines, and Ace Harland. So you had some amazing tattooists, also trained by Cap Coleman, who trained Paul Rogers, or was one of his mentors. So you had some really great people behind Huck, and Huck grew his business with some great supplies, as well as became a great tattooist himself under guidance from these guys. So Huck did some fantastic back pieces. He's well known for his piece on Tom DeVita, which you can see there, and he did Al Sheafley's back piece. By the late 1900s, you had 37,000 customers buying from Spalding and Rogers. 37,000 tattooists around the world, and that's a huge number. But not everyone liked Huck, and this is some of the reasons why. So Huck, being a businessman, saw that Fazandi and Sparrow was one of the biggest sources of ink pigment for tattooists around the world. So he immediately went out and bought that company and increased the prices of ink pigment powders by about 5 or 6 times. And so every tattooist in the world found overnight that the price of their main ingredient, inks, had just gone through the roof thanks to Huck. So you can imagine that made him pretty popular. He made no distinction on who he sold to. Anyone, if you had money, you could buy from Spalding and Rogers, and he still does today. Huck has passed away. You can still go on to Spalding and Rogers and buy tattoo equipment, and they sell tattoo kits. It'll come with autoclaves, machines. It'll even come with a certificate of excellence. So on day one, you're an excellent tattooist, according to your certificate. He marketed very aggressively, and through trade magazines, through conventions, these sorts of things. And the main concern with advertising, to the extent that he did, was he was making the trade of tattooing so commonly, a lot more people were aware of it. It was published as a trade that you could make money from. And so he was basically attracting more people to become tattooists, and that didn't really sit that well with people who were tattooists, because they were quite protective with their trade. They didn't want more people moving in, and Huck was bringing them in by the hundreds. As a result, you get things like this. So this is a poster that was widely circulated. It says, it's a wanted poster for Huck Spalding. It says, any resemblance to a human is accidental. Wanted for selling equipment to junkies, morons and children, and for imitating a large hemorrhoid. If found, remove head. Obtain a post office box under a false name, and tattoo artist will send you money. You will be a billionaire in 10 to 12 hours. So, that was what was going on with Spalding and Rogers. It is a great company. A lot of people bought great stuff from it, but it was also a divisive one. And in response to what was going on, we had companies like National turn up. And National was opened by, it was made in response to Spalding and Rogers in particular, with the ink buyout by Crazy Eddie Philadelphia. He saw that. Eddie ran a whole bunch of studios around America, and he didn't like what he was seeing. He thought Huck is going to take over the world and we're going to be crushed. So he started his own supply company, and he set his sister Flo and her husband Don up with National Tattoo Supply. And the deal was he would get them set up, he would get them all with the right equipment, and then they would provide him with equipment for his tattoo studios at cost. And so everyone wins. I don't think they knew how big that company would be, because it became one of the biggest supply companies in the world. It was very well respected. It had great artists involved in it, like Bob Shaw, Bert Grimm, Terry Wrigley and Painless Jeff Baker, and a whole bunch more behind it. So very high ethical standard behind them, very competent artists, and they had a lot of fun. National conferences were epic, and they were really good, and they were well attended. So it's a well-loved company that closed, sadly, this year. So it's been closing for the last 2 years. They shut down, the website is down, you can no longer buy them. And part of it was that Don and Flo, they're in their 80s, they wanted to retire, quite rightly so. They didn't feel that there was a buyer that perhaps could keep running the company at the standard and level that they wanted, and so it was let go. Also, the effects of the COVID period just crippled them in terms of costs. And these old companies also run a lot of coil stuff, and it's not as popular as rotary, so they struggle to compete. Johnny Dollar, our Australian connection, the last bit of Australian history. John Entwistle, still tattoos. You can find him at Punt Road in Melbourne. He's an absolute legend. I met him last year and got tattooed by him and bought some equipment actually just for fun. John sold a lot of stuff from National, so things like this powdered pigment here, which is, if you've never seen powdered pigment, come and check it out. That's from National there. That's now an antique. John saw the challenges that Australian artists were faced with, trying to buy stuff. Not a lot is made in Australia, still very little is made today. So he knew that artists had to deal with, all the way to America. They had to write to the supplier companies, they had to get a catalogue, they had to fill out the catalogue, fill out the cheque, send it to those guys, and the guys would put the order together and then they'd ship it back. And, it did take weeks to months to get your supplies. So John set up a supply company. He was already a fantastic tattooist. He was also a machine maker and builder. He invented his own quick change vise, which is just a beautiful little vise for coil machines. His grill style tattoo machines are absolutely beautiful. There's one on display here at the PTAA convention tent outside that's worth checking out if you've never seen one. And it's a great company. John's a lot of fun to have a chat to if you get the chance. He wasn't the first, of course. There's lots of other Australian suppliers out there. Wally Hammond here in Sydney sold from his studio in King's Cross. He sold a bunch of stuff, pigments and machines. And Steve Paul out in Mildura was well known for his flash. So Steve sold internationally his commercial flash. So we have a strong Australian history in supply internationally.